In 2020, a country with roughly 1,600 citizens, fewer people than a single large high school, declared a marine protected area covering 40% of its own ocean territory. A stretch of Pacific water larger than the entire land area of Germany. No navy patrols it, no massive Coast Guard fleet enforces it. Just a tiny island nation deciding on its own initiative that an ocean nearly nobody else was watching deserved protecting anyway. To understand how a population smaller than most shopping malls ended up custodians of one of the largest marine sanctuaries on the planet, you have to go back over 1,000 years, to the moment the first people ever set foot on a lump of coral rock the locals still simply call, with a mixture of pride and dry humour, the Rock. That nickname isn't marketing. It's a literal description of an island with no beaches worth mentioning, no fertile river deltas, and no natural harbour deep enough to shelter a proper fleet. A place that has never once made anything easy for the people who chose, generation after generation, to keep living there anyway. Niue sits alone in the South Pacific, roughly 2,500 kilometres northeast of New Zealand, and a similar distance from its nearest inhabited neighbours, Tonga and Samoa, making it one of the most isolated islands in all of Polynesia. Unlike the volcanic peaks and lush river valleys that define most of the Pacific islands nearby, Niue is what geologists call a raised coral atoll, a slab of ancient coral reef that pushed up out of the sea over millions of years until it sat roughly 60 metres above current sea level, leaving the entire island without a single permanent river, lake or stream anywhere on its surface. Rainwater disappears almost immediately into the porous limestone, carving out an extraordinary network of underground caves, chasms, and sea-facing caverns that locals still explore and swim through today, but leaving nothing visible on the surface for early settlers to drink from directly. That same porous coral foundation that denied the island easy fresh water also gave it something else. A coastline riddled with dramatic limestone chasms, natural swimming holes fed by underground streams, and a coral reef wall dropping almost immediately into some of the clearest open ocean water anywhere in the Pacific, since there's no river runoff anywhere on the island to cloud it with sediment. Divers who visit today routinely describe visibility stretching past 60 metres in open water just offshore, an almost unnervingly clear blue that locals grew up treating as ordinary long before anyone thought to market it as a tourist attraction. And inland, chasms like Talava and Avaiki cut so deep into the coral that sunlight filtering down through narrow openings creates pools of impossibly turquoise water hidden entirely from view unless you know exactly where in the forest to climb down and look for them. The first people to settle Niue arrived by canoe sometime around the year 900, most likely from Samoa and Tonga, bringing with them the broader Polynesian voyaging culture that had already spread human settlement across thousands of kilometres of open Pacific water, using nothing but stars, currents, and generations of accumulated navigational knowledge. Unlike many neighbouring Pacific societies that eventually consolidated under a single hereditary king, Niuean society, for most of its history, remained deliberately decentralised, organised instead around a patchwork of independent villages and clan leaders who cooperated on some matters and fiercely guarded their own autonomy on others. A political structure some historians believe developed specifically in response to the island's harsh, waterless terrain, which made large centralised settlements and standing armies far less practical than they were on more fertile islands nearby. Villages built their lives around small garden plots tucked into pockets of soil-filled coral sinkholes, supplemented constantly by fishing along the reef and foraging in the island's dense interior forest, developing a warrior tradition and a fierce reputation for defending their coastline that would very shortly become the island's first real brush with the outside world. Picture a young village leader we'll call Toafa standing watch on a coastal bluff sometime in the early 18th century, responsible for organising his community's response the moment any unfamiliar sail appeared on the horizon. A role passed down through his family for generations, precisely because the island's lack of a natural harbour meant any approaching vessel had to be assessed and, if necessary, repelled well before it ever got close enough to land a landing party ashore. That same vigilance, born from centuries of practical necessity rather than any particular hostility toward outsiders, would define nearly every early encounter between Niueans and the wider world for the next century and a half. That reputation announced itself unmistakably in 1774 when Captain James Cook attempted to land on the island during his second Pacific voyage and was met on 3 separate attempts at 3 different points along the coast by armed warriors who rushed toward his landing parties, displaying teeth stained a deep, alarming red from chewing the hehau plant, a common local practice with no connection whatsoever to violence, but one that Cook and his crew, unfamiliar with the custom, interpreted as evidence the islanders were cannibals freshly finished with a meal. Cook retreated for good after the 3rd attempt, naming the island Savage Island in his ship's log, a name that stuck on European maps for the better part of the following century, despite having essentially nothing to do with how Niueans actually lived, and despite the fact that the warriors' aggressive welcome had far more to do with defending their home from an armed, unfamiliar ship than with any interest in eating its crew. The name Savage Island would follow the island through most of its written European history, a linguistic accident born from one afternoon of mutual misunderstanding that outlasted almost everyone involved in creating it. Cook himself, to his credit, recorded in his own journals that he suspected the red teeth and aggressive posturing were more likely a deliberate defensive display than genuine evidence of cannibalism. But the more sensational interpretation travelled faster and further than his own private skepticism ever did, and European mapmakers copying his charts had little incentive to soften a name that made for a far more memorable entry than whatever the island's own people actually called their home. Sustained outside contact didn't really begin until the 1830s, when the London Missionary Society, already active across much of Polynesia, began working to bring Christianity to an island whose reputation for repelling visitors had discouraged most previous attempts. The breakthrough came not from a European missionary at all, but from a Niuean man named Fetuolemoana, who had left the island as a young man, encountered Christian teaching while living in Samoa, and returned home determined to convert his own people rather than wait for outsiders to attempt it themselves. Fetuolemoana's early efforts met real resistance, including periods when he was forced to flee for his own safety as village leaders pushed back against a belief system that directly challenged existing spiritual and political authority. But within a few decades, Christianity had spread across the island's villages with a speed and thoroughness that surprised even the missionaries who had originally sent teachers to assist him. And the London Missionary Society's version of Protestant Christianity remains the dominant faith on the island to this day, a rare case of a Pacific Islands conversion being driven primarily by one of its own returning sons, rather than by resident foreign missionaries. Fetuolemoana reportedly carried little more than a Samoan language Bible and a handful of hymn translations when he first returned, preaching from village to village on foot along coastal paths that offered no easy shortcut between settlements, and the same decentralized political structure that had once made the island hard to conquer militarily turned out, ironically, to make it easier for a single determined local convert to win over one village leader at a time rather than needing to overcome a single, centralized authority capable of blocking the new religion outright. By the 1860s, a very different and far more dangerous kind of outside contact began reaching Niue's shores. Peruvian slave ships, engaged in what became known across the Pacific as blackbirding, the forced or deceptively recruited abduction of islanders to work under brutal conditions on plantations and in guano mines thousands of kilometers away in South America. Niue's villages, already wary of outsiders after Cook's visit nearly a century earlier, responded to blackbirding raids with the same coordinated coastal vigilance that had once repelled European ships, organising lookouts and defensive parties specifically to prevent slavers from luring islanders aboard with false promises of trade or wages. The threat was serious enough and frightening enough that island leaders eventually made a deliberate political calculation. Better to formally request the protection of a distant, less immediately threatening imperial power than to keep fending off slave raiders alone indefinitely. A request that would set in motion the island's formal entry into the British colonial system by the century's end. Village lookouts reportedly grew skilled enough at recognising the distinctive rigging and hull profiles of known blackbirding vessels that several ships were turned away from the coast entirely before a single islander could be lured or forced aboard. A defensive record local oral history still treats with genuine pride, even as neighbouring island groups across Polynesia and Melanesia suffered devastating population losses to the same trade during roughly the same decades. It's worth pausing here on a connection to another island story this channel has already told, because the two places share more in common than their small size alone would suggest. The Isle of Man, a modest island sitting in the middle of the Irish Sea, roughly equidistant from England, Scotland, Ireland and Wales, spent centuries governing itself through Tynwald, the oldest continuously running parliament on Earth, while quietly watching wave after wave of its own population leave for opportunities on the larger islands surrounding it, eventually rebuilding its economy around international finance precisely because its small, stable, semi-independent legal system made it useful to the wider world in ways a larger, more ordinary jurisdiction couldn't easily replicate. Niue's own story follows a similar emotional shape from the opposite side of the planet. A tiny, fiercely self-governing population, historically wary of larger outside powers, eventually finding that its very smallness and independence, rather than being a permanent handicap, could become the exact quality that let it do something a bigger, more bureaucratically encumbered nation might never attempt at all. Both islands prove, oceans apart, that self-governance at a small scale isn't automatically a disadvantage waiting to be outgrown. Sometimes it's the entire point. Formal British protection arrived in 1900, when Niue became a British protectorate at the explicit request of its own chiefs. A request driven as much by fear of further slave raids and unwanted annexation by other competing powers, as by any particular enthusiasm for British rule itself. Niuean chiefs had specifically petitioned Queen Victoria directly on more than one occasion in the preceding years, reasoning that formal recognition by a major imperial power, even one that showed little practical interest in actually administering such a small, remote possession, offered better protection than remaining fully independent and exposed to whichever slave ship or ambitious lesser power happened to sail past next. That arrangement lasted barely a year before Britain transferred administrative responsibility for the island to New Zealand in 1901, folding Niue into the same colonial framework New Zealand was already using to administer the nearby Cook Islands, even though Niue's own culture, language and political history had developed almost entirely independently of its new Cook Islands neighbours, and shared little beyond general Polynesian ancestry and a new colonial administrator based thousands of kilometres away in Wellington. Niueans themselves had almost no say in that particular bureaucratic decision, made largely for the administrative convenience of officials in London and Wellington, rather than out of any careful consideration of the island's own distinct identity. A pattern of outside powers making consequential decisions about Niue's future with minimal local input that would recur in various forms for much of the following century. The following 7 decades under New Zealand administration brought genuine, measurable improvements in healthcare, education, and basic infrastructure that reduced disease and extended life expectancy considerably compared to the pre-contact era. But it also entrenched a lasting economic dependency that has shaped nearly every subsequent chapter of the island's history. New Zealand-appointed resident commissioners held broad authority over island affairs throughout this period, and while several took a genuine, sympathetic interest in Niuean welfare, the fundamental power dynamic remained one where decisions about the island's schools, land use, and economic priorities were ultimately made or approved by an administrator answerable to Wellington, rather than to the villagers actually living with the consequences. Niue produced little in the way of exportable cash crops beyond small quantities of copra, passion fruit and limes, and New Zealand government administrators, teachers and medical staff made up a disproportionate share of the island's formal economy for most of the 20th century, creating a pattern where meaningful economic opportunity increasingly meant opportunity somewhere other than Niue itself, a pattern that would eventually reshape the island's population far more dramatically than any single historical event before it. New Zealand-run schools taught largely in English rather than Niuean for much of this period, part of a broader colonial-era assumption that fluency in the administering power's language represented the surest path to opportunity. And while the policy did produce generations of Niueans comfortable navigating New Zealand institutions once they eventually left the island, it also quietly weakened the everyday use of the Niuean language at home, even before mass emigration began accelerating the same decline from an entirely different direction. In 1974, Niueans voted overwhelmingly to become self-governing in free association with New Zealand, a constitutional arrangement nearly identical to the one the Cook Islands had adopted a few years earlier, granting the island full internal self-government, while every Niuean simultaneously held, and still holds today, full New Zealand citizenship and the unrestricted right to live and work anywhere in New Zealand itself. The vote itself passed with overwhelming support, reflecting a population that wanted genuine control over its own domestic affairs, without severing the practical safety net a small, resource-limited island still relied on for healthcare referrals, higher education, and disaster relief that its own tiny government simply couldn't provide entirely on its own. That single citizenship provision, intended at the time as a practical safety net for a small, economically limited population, ended up triggering one of the most dramatic demographic transformations of any Pacific nation. Picture a young woman we'll call Fetuolemoana boarding a flight out of Niue's small airstrip in 1976, with a suitcase, a small stipend saved from years of subsistence farming, and a vague plan to find factory or hospitality work in Auckland, where an older cousin had already settled 2 years earlier and reported steady wages that dwarfed anything available back home. Fetuolemoana never intended to stay permanently, planning instead to work a few years, save money, and return to help her aging parents. but steady employment, a growing circle of fellow Niuean migrants building an entire expatriate community in South Auckland, and eventually a marriage and children of her own, kept redrawing that plan year after year. The same story repeating itself across thousands of individual Niuean families throughout the following decades. She wrote home faithfully at first, describing an Auckland winter colder and greyer than anything she'd experienced on the Rock. Factory shifts that paid more in a single week than months of subsistence farming ever had. And a growing sense of guilt every time a letter arrived from her mother, mentioning the family's taro patch or a cousin's new baby back home. Milestones she was missing in real time from 10,000 kilometers away. By the time her own children were old enough to ask about Niue, Fetuolemoana found herself teaching them the language and customs largely from memory and second-hand recordings rather than daily lived experience, raising a generation of New Zealand-born Niueans who would grow up considering the island an ancestral homeland to visit rather than the place they actually called home. The cumulative effect of thousands of decisions, just like Fetuolemoana's, proved staggering. Niue's resident population, which stood at roughly 5,000 people in the mid-1960s, collapsed to under 1,600 by the 21st century, even as the number of people of Niuean descent living in New Zealand grew to more than 30,000, meaning roughly 20 Niueans now live in New Zealand for every one who still lives on Niue itself. Entire villages that once supported schools, churches and thriving extended family compounds now stand largely empty for much of the year, filling briefly during holiday visits when diaspora families return to reconnect with grandparents, ancestral land, and a culture that survives more robustly today in South Auckland living rooms than in many of the actual villages it originated from, an inversion of the usual relationship between homeland and diaspora that few other nations on Earth experience at anywhere near this scale. Whole extended family compounds that once housed 3 generations under connected roofs now sit maintained but largely unoccupied for 11 months of the year, kept in reasonable repair by whichever relatives remain, specifically so the annual Christmas and New Year homecoming, when flights from Auckland fill with returning families, has somewhere proper to gather. Government officials on Niue today openly acknowledge the strangeness of governing a nation where national rugby matches and church choir competitions in South Auckland routinely draw larger crowds of engaged Niueans than equivalent events held on the island itself, and policy debates in the island's own legislative assembly regularly grapple with a question few other governments ever have to seriously consider. How do you plan a nation's future for a population that mostly doesn't live inside its own borders anymore? Just as the island's population crisis seemed to be settling into a slow, manageable decline, nature delivered a devastating blow of its own. In January of 2004, Cyclone Heta, one of the most powerful storms ever recorded in the South Pacific, struck Niue almost directly, sending waves reportedly reaching 30 meters up the island's coastal cliffs and flattening large sections of the capital, Alofi, including the island's only hospital, the main government administration building, and dozens of homes along the low-lying coastal strip. Remarkably, given the storm's sheer power, the death toll remained limited to a small handful of people, largely thanks to effective early warning and evacuation to higher ground inland. But the physical destruction accelerated an emigration wave that was already well underway, with some residents choosing, in the storm's immediate aftermath, that rebuilding a life on an island this vulnerable and this depopulated no longer made sense compared to permanently joining family already established in New Zealand. Reconstruction aid arrived from New Zealand, Australia, and several international relief agencies, and within a few years, Alofi's hospital and government offices had been rebuilt to more resilient modern standards on marginally higher ground. But the psychological impact of watching the capital's core infrastructure flattened by a single storm lingered far longer than the physical rebuilding did. And Cyclone Heta remains, for most Niueans still living on the island today, the single most vividly remembered event of their own lifetimes. Discussed with the specific, detailed clarity people usually reserve for genuinely defining moments rather than ordinary weather. Survivors still describe the strange, thick silence in the minutes before the storm's core arrived. The sea pulling back further than anyone on the island had ever witnessed, and the sound of 30-metre waves striking the coastal cliffs described less as a crash than a continuous, deafening roar that some residents compared afterward to standing beside a jet engine for hours without any way to escape the noise. Facing a population too small to sustain most conventional industries and a geography too isolated for most large-scale agricultural exports, Niue's government spent the following decades pursuing a series of genuinely unconventional economic strategies that turned out to punch well above the island's tiny weight. In 1997, Niue registered the internet domain suffix .nu, and rather than reserving it purely for local use, leased the rights internationally, discovering an unexpectedly lucrative market in the Netherlands, where the word nu happens to mean now in Dutch, making .nu web addresses genuinely appealing to Dutch businesses wanting a short, meaningful domain name, generating steady licensing revenue for the tiny national government from a linguistic coincidence nobody involved in registering the domain could have planned for. At its peak, .nu domain licensing reportedly generated enough annual revenue to meaningfully supplement the island's entire government budget. An almost absurd outcome for a decision originally made mostly to give the island some kind of functioning internet presence, rather than as any deliberate international business strategy. And Niuean officials have since openly credited the domain's unexpected popularity with funding infrastructure projects that might otherwise have taken considerably longer to complete. In 2003, with funding assistance from an American non-profit and later from New Zealand government support, Niue became one of the first countries in the world to offer free wireless internet access across its entire inhabited territory, turning an infrastructure limitation, a small population too dispersed to justify conventional telecom investment, into a genuine point of national distinction that international tech journalists covered as a curiosity precisely because almost nowhere else on Earth had managed it at a whole country scale. The free Wi-Fi network also proved unexpectedly practical during cyclone season, letting isolated households check emergency broadcasts and contact overseas family the moment cell towers came back online after a storm. A resilience benefit nobody had specifically planned for when the network was first installed purely as a modernization project. Today, Niue's economy runs on a mixture that would look scattered and improvised on a larger nation, but makes practical sense for an island this small. A modest but growing tourism sector built around diving with pods of humpback whales that pass close to the island's steep coral drop-offs each winter. Snorkeling alongside Fetuolemoana, a docile species of banded sea snake found almost nowhere else in such accessible numbers, and considered by many Niueans a spiritually significant guardian of the reef, rather than simply a curiosity for visiting divers to photograph. And exploring the same limestone chasms and sea caves that once denied the island fresh water, but now draw visitors specifically for their otherworldly, cavern-lit beauty. Local export agriculture still centres on vanilla, taro, and the noni fruit prized in traditional medicine, while a smaller but culturally significant trade continues in uga, a large native coconut crab considered a genuine delicacy and now subject to careful harvest limits after decades of over-collection nearly wiped out the population entirely, restrictions enforced largely through community-level agreement rather than heavy-handed government policing, since a population this small and this interconnected tends to know exactly who's still hunting uga out of season without needing a formal inspector to tell them. The Niuean language, spoken as a first language by a shrinking share of both resident islanders and diaspora children growing up in New Zealand, faces the same slow generational erosion that has threatened small indigenous languages across the Pacific, prompting community-led revival classes in both Niue and Auckland, aimed at keeping the language alive across a population now permanently split between two very different shores. Picture a dive guide we'll call Sione, leading a group of visiting tourists through the Talava Arches on a clear morning, narrating the chasm's formation in fluent English for his guests, while switching effortlessly into Niuean the moment his radio crackles with a question from a fellow guide back at the dock, one of a shrinking number of islanders young enough to have grown up genuinely bilingual, rather than having learned Niuean later in life as a deliberate act of cultural preservation. Sione makes a comfortable living guiding visitors through caves and reef walls that draw a modest but steady stream of divers, specifically seeking out a destination most people can't immediately place on a map, and he says, only half joking, that explaining exactly where Niue is has become as routine a part of his job as briefing guests on reef safety. None of this erases the harder realities the island still faces. A population this small and this scattered struggles to staff hospitals, schools, and basic government services at a level larger nations take for granted. And every cyclone season carries the genuine possibility of another Cyclone Heta scale disaster hitting an island with limited resources to recover from it twice. Climate change poses an especially uncomfortable irony for a nation that has positioned itself as an environmental leader. Rising sea temperatures threaten the exact coral reef systems the island's tourism economy and marine protections depend on, even as Niue itself contributes essentially nothing to the emissions driving that change. A frustration Niuean officials raise repeatedly at international climate forums, where nations responsible for the overwhelming majority of global emissions often move at a pace that feels glacial compared to the urgency of watching your own coral reefs bleach in real time. And the demographic hollowing out shows no clear sign of reversing, with each generation of young Niueans facing the same basic calculation Fetuolemoana faced decades earlier. Genuine opportunity increasingly means leaving the island that gave them their identity in the first place. International development agencies periodically debate whether a nation this small and this dependent on outside support can genuinely be considered self-sufficient at all. A fair enough question, given how much of the island's budget still arrives as aid and support from New Zealand each year. Support that funds everything from the hospital rebuilt after Cyclone Heta to the salaries of teachers in the island's small public school system. Though Niueans themselves tend to answer that question less in terms of economic self-sufficiency and more in terms of a self-governance they've now held onto in one form or another for well over a century of foreign administrators, missionaries, and would-be colonizers passing through. Which brings the story back, finally, to that ocean the size of Germany. When Niue's government designated the Niue Moana Mahu Marine Protected Area in 2020, covering roughly 40% of its exclusive economic zone and banning commercial fishing and mining across the entire protected zone, it wasn't backed by a large navy, a wealthy sovereign fund, or significant international pressure demanding the move. It was backed by a population smaller than many individual apartment buildings, deciding that a fiercely self-governing island with a 1,000-year history of defending its own coastline and making its own decisions, from repelling Cook's landing parties to organising lookouts against slave raiders, to choosing self-government over full independence in 1974, wasn't about to treat the ocean surrounding it as somebody else's problem, simply because the island itself had grown small. The same stubborn, independent instinct that once painted warriors' teeth red to frighten off an unwelcome ship now protects humpback whale migration routes and coral ecosystems that most of the rest of the world will never see. Managed by roughly 1,600 people who have spent over 1,000 years proving that a population's size and a nation's ambition were never actually the same measurement. Stand on the same coastal bluff where Toafa's descendants once kept watch for unfamiliar sails, and it's easy enough to see why. The ocean stretching out from that cliff edge looks exactly as vast and indifferent as it always has. And the island's answer to that vastness across every single century covered here has never been to grow bigger. It's simply been to keep deciding, deliberately and on its own terms, exactly what kind of relationship it wants to have with everything surrounding it.